Flight MH370, one of the greatest mysteries in the history of civil aviation. On March 8, 2014, a Boeing 777 belonging to Malaysian Airlines suddenly disappeared from radar screens with 2,039 people on board. It will never be seen again.
A Boeing 777 obviously doesn't just disappear.
So right out of the gate, it's clear that something very unusual and very strange was happening with this airplane.
In July 2018, after 4 years of investigation, Malaysia abandons the search and comes to a terrible conclusion. It is not able to determine the causes of the aircraft loss.
Australia, China, and Malaysia have collectively decided to suspend the search.
In the first episode of this documentary series, we will attempt to understand the failure of this investigation, which monopolized hundreds of experts and cost millions of dollars.
The reason for the failure is that we didn't search the right area.
I think the fundamental problem was that Malaysia was ill-prepared.
We unveiled the inconsistencies published in the official report.
I started to realize that everything we had been told, which substantiated the idea of a turnback and of a flight over Malaysia, was completely unfounded.
This had never been mentioned. No data collected from that had ever been mentioned.
We also shone a light on the gray areas surrounding this extraordinary case.
So, is MH370 a crime scene? Is it a crime? Are we investigating a crime here? The possibility is certainly yes.
But the story doesn't end there. Today, many experts refuse to accept this conclusion. Driven by the desire to understand what happened to Flight MH370, they have been reviewing the investigation in an attempt to find out more.
Clearly, all these events and points are not a coincidence.
I realized there are reports and maybe there is something to do behind it.
In the second episode, they reveal unprecedented discoveries that help us understand what happened in the night of March 8, 2014.
This cargo is loaded without being scanned.
What it later turned out was that the Inmarsat communication system had been turned off and then turned back on again.
After the diversion, there were 7 turns. If no one's flying it, there's no reason for an aircraft to do 7 turns.
We have a credible witness that also corroborates the hypothesis of a crash in the South China Sea. And so, my theory starts to take shape.
Why and how did Flight MH370 disappear?
From my perspective, there's 3 sides to every story. Your side, my side, and the truth is somewhere between the two.
Never before have we been so close to the truth. July 2017, in the middle of the Indian Ocean. For more than 3 years, Australian authorities have been pursuing the largest underwater search campaign in history. But after spending over 1,000 days at sea, exploring more than 120,000 square kilometers off seabed, or 3 times the size of the state of Mississippi, the investigators have to face reality. This mission is quasi-impossible.
It is indeed a needle in a haystack, but it's even worse than that, because, in my opinion, it's a field of haystacks. First, you have to find the haystack that might hold the needle.
We were faced with an extremely large area, like an arc of a circle off the coast of Australia that wasn't just a precise line, but a whole strip. And when you do the math, it corresponds to a totally gigantic area that had to be searched.
Unfortunately, with all the ships that were in that region doing the searching, we still were not able to locate the aircraft, which, quite frankly, is not that surprising considering the scale of ocean that had to be searched.
How can they continue spending so much money without being sure of finding the wreckage? In July 2017, the authorities make a difficult decision and put an end to the search for flight MH370.
And in the absence of credible new evidence, Australia, China, and Malaysia have collectively decided to suspend the search upon the completion of the 120,000 square kilometer search area.
A year later, Malaysia publishes the official report of their investigation in which they acknowledge their failure. Despite 4 years of work, the mystery seems unsolvable. To their great despair, the families of the victims have obtained no answers.
It was unbearable for the families. Everyone knows that mourning without a body is much, much more complicated. That's why I have immense sympathy for these families.
While the nations in charge of the investigation seem to give up, several voices around the world make themselves heard with one conviction: it is essential to understand the reasons behind this disappearance.
We should not sustain the idea that we can lose an aircraft, okay? So there's a couple of thousand people who are going to bed every night, waking up every morning, and they don't know where their relatives and their friends are. And I think that is something that should be closed as well. That matter should be closed.
The reason why it failed is that they didn't look in the right place. The area was so vast. A number of assumptions were made about the trajectory of the aircraft. They defined an area, they searched, and found nothing, which means the wreck was elsewhere.
I do believe that the aircraft will be found. We've just got to try harder.
While many enthusiasts decide to conduct their own counter-investigation, a unique group of experts start to emerge as a reference in the aviation community. Its name? The Independent Group. Among its members are Don Thompson and journalist Jeff Wise, both obsessed with this mystery.
At a time where there was so much misinformation, so much lunacy, so much crazy, ungrounded ideas, and people like with mental health issues who were throwing in like their visions and their ideas that were just loopy. And so to have a group of people who could kind of gather together, and really keep it to a strict technical discussion was very invaluable.
The initial objectives of the independent group were really to establish what observations and data were actually factual, were credible, and therefore could be taken forward to try and determine where the aircraft impacted the ocean.
The first 6 months were kind of the glory period, where we were really making progress and kind of pooling our insight, pooling our technical knowledge, exchanging ideas, and coming up with a really well-grounded, scientifically grounded set of explanations.
When Malaysia publishes its investigative report on July 30th, 2018, the group of experts is quick to voice its viewpoint.
The Malaysian investigation is just simply not rigorous enough. And certainly they're not demonstrating any real level of rigor. That's kind of frustrating because ultimately it's a Malaysian problem. The aircraft was operated by Malaysian Airlines, it was operated out of a Malaysian airport, etc.
Little by little, several experts form an opinion. To maximize the chances of finding the aircraft, the satellite data must be studied in more detail so as to determine with more accuracy the end of the trajectory of Flight MH370 after passing the 7th arc.
The Australian Civil Aviation Safety Authority began with the assumption that the 7th arc was indeed the end of the flight, and that it was where the plane had exhausted its fuel. With the analysis of the Inmarsat satellite data, they concluded that since the downward speed was very high, the plane was in free fall or nose down, and that the drop point was very close to the 7th arc. But they didn't know exactly what trajectory it had followed. The plane continued to fly after the last Inmarsat signal. What did it do afterwards? Did it continue to glide? A plane gliding at this altitude can fly for 120 kilometers. It can fall steeply. If you don't make these hypotheses, you get nothing from the Inmarsat data.
As a result, engineer Don Thompson tries to put satellite data to the test of a new hypothesis. What if the plane had continued to glide after exhausting its fuel at the 7th arc? After several weeks of work and calculations, the engineer determines a new sector, still in the vicinity of the 7th arc, but this time located further south.
It then became feasible for independent investigators to execute some flight path modeling. That allowed us to make some amendments to the assumptions we had carried to that time and become more precise about the line of the 7th arc. The line of the 7th arc is really the most critical one because it's the line of position that describes where the aircraft is likely to have impacted the ocean.
Could this new boundary contain the wreckage of Flight MH370? The independent group is hopeful. Without hesitation, they transmit their results to the authorities. In the Malaysian capital, nearly a year after throwing in the towel, the authorities make an unexpected announcement. The search will resume. This time, they will be led by the American company Ocean Infinity.
Based on the agreement, Ocean Infinity will undertake search operation to locate Flight MH370 at an area of 25,000 square kilometers search at the South Indian Ocean. Most important, they must find the debris field. A debris field then is just a piece of wreckage, but it has to be the plane, the aircraft, and or the flight recorder.
We were able to bring some fresh sight to that, and indeed that was what we took away from that was adopted for the 2018 search. All the parties agreed on a definitive line of position for the 7th arc.
Will the independent group's work finally lead to the recovery of Flight MH370? For the families, hope is rekindled.
So at least there is still hope. You have not given up, and neither have we. All right, so we are thankful for the government of Malaysia to say yes, lifted the suspension and started the search again. Hopefully at the end of the day, we can put it all to rest.
On January 23, 2018, new searches began in the South Indian Ocean. A state-of-the-art oceanographic boat is dispatched to the site with the greatest experts on board. For this last chance mission, 8 autonomous underwater vehicles, or AUVs, are mobilized. These drones are capable of diving to a record 5,000 meters deep. Equipped with high-precision sonar, they coordinate to probe the seabed and find suspicious debris.
They have phenomenal equipment. They have the ultimate in underwater drones. These are drones of military origin that are much bigger and have much more powerful sonar. Ocean Infinity is able to operate 8 or more simultaneously, so they can cover much larger areas and a lot faster.
I do believe that the technology to search the seafloor is increasing in its effectiveness. So we can cover more ground, we can do that more cheaply. So it becomes more cost effective to do these things. It will be found, and I think it needs to be found.
But despite 90 days of hard work in the Indian Ocean, Flight MH370 remains without a trace. The new area demarcated by the independent group yields nothing. After this failure, new Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad appears defeated, almost overwhelmed in front of the press.
We cannot keep on searching for something that we really cannot find. If anybody has any information, we will consider resuming the search. But at the moment, we have to put a stop to the search.
Despite state-of-the-art technology and high-level scientific work, the wreckage of Flight MH370 is nowhere to be found. For many experts, a burning question now arises. What if they had to go back to square one? Between Hong Kong and Paris, investigative journalist Florence Duchangi works tirelessly to understand this case. What happened on the night of March 8, 2014? Since the beginning of her counter-investigation, she has been inhabited by a firm belief.
At first, I could accept that it was very complicated. But as time passes by, it became less plausible and less acceptable that the plane simply vanished. And this obviously has massive consequences, not only for the friends and families of the 239 people who were on board, but also for civil aviation. Tens of millions of people travel every day. The idea that you can board a plane and totally disappear, never to return, is totally unacceptable.
Where have the Malaysians failed since 2014? One by one, the journalist re-examines all the clues of the official investigation, starting with the Inmarsat data. What if it is misleading? Is it possible that investigators relied on it too much in their search for the plane?
You really have to be aware that the official version is based exclusively on the Inmarsat data. We're talking numbers and letters on a piece of paper. And it's on the basis of these tenuous signals, to say the least, that they claimed with certainty that the plane had crashed in the Indian Ocean. I mean, come on, seriously?
Could the Inmarsat signals have misled investigators? For many experts, this data is part of the rare solid elements of the investigation.
Si on ne croit pas à la validité de ces signaux
If you don't believe in the validity of these Inmarsat signals, that means you think they've been completely reconstructed. The idea that this company would collude from top to bottom in order to invent false signals seems very, very implausible. Now that we've analyzed the data we have from different angles, with these various hypotheses and with the various referencing of other data, the probability that it's been tampered with is very low. Inmarsat wouldn't do that because their credibility is at stake. They're operators, they have responsibilities, and they wouldn't discredit themselves by tampering with data. Inventing such a conspiracy is quite a stretch. I think that there would have been leaks or that glaring inconsistencies would have been detected after a while, neither of which happened.
Florence de Changi continues to doubt the veracity of the information provided by the official Malaysian version. Rereading the investigative report, a first element seems incoherent to her: the radar images which indicate that the plane turned back.
When you look at what the report says about these radar images that supposedly support the overflight, you realize that they're incredibly inconsistent with the Boeing 777. It's crazy to see in the report itself that the first chapter about Malaysian military radar says the following. It became very apparent, however, that the recorded altitude and speed change were well beyond the capability of the aircraft. That's insane. The whole report starts by saying that the flight of a Boeing 777 doesn't match the data. I don't know what else you need to denounce the invalidity of the data.
For engineer Jean-Luc Marchand, there is an explanation for this contradictory information.
The quality of the data is indeed questionable. Personally, I think the fluctuation of the data is due to the system itself. We're not sure that it was well calibrated, that it was regularly running well, that the maintenance was done properly, or that the signal processing was clean enough to rebuild the echoes well.
How is it that this ultra-monitored area boarding several countries, but the Malaysian military radar was the only one to record the U-turn?
No one saw the plane over Malaysia. Of the 7 countries that had radar in the region, not one has been able to provide any radar image of this aircraft. None of the fleets present in the area, whether American, Thai, or Singaporean, especially since there were military exercises, no one had the slightest trace of this plane. I began to realize that everything we'd been told that gave credence to the idea of the U-turn, the idea of flying over Malaysia and going up the Malacca Strait and the final flight to the Indian Ocean was totally unsubstantiated.
Little by little, the reporter becomes convinced. It's not only the Malaysian investigation that must be questioned, but the disappearance itself.
An airplane, let alone a Boeing 777, meaning a large aircraft with a length and wingspan of over 60 meters, doesn't just disappear. You can't just claim, in this day and age, that you've lost a Boeing 777. Soon after the crash came the reaction of Tim Clark, Sir Tim Clark, the president of Emirates, one of the biggest and best airlines in the world, with the largest fleet of Boeing 777s. He was the first to say loud and clear that he didn't believe a word of the story, because a Boeing 777, which his company has more of than anyone else, doesn't just disappear. And It raises concerns that someone with such experience, expertise, status, and credibility would stick their neck out and alienate everyone else by saying loud and clear that this story makes no sense.
How could flight MH370 be lost? What if a military operation was actually behind its disappearance? Little by little, Florence Duchangy built her hypothesis.
In 2014, I heard about a Frenchman who was directly involved in this case for having lost his wife and 2 of his 3 children. He started to share some information with me. In particular, he told me that from the beginning, there was information that American AWACS, planes which are like radar stations in flight or eyes in the sky, were present. A high-level source told him that there were American AWACS in the area and that the Americans knew what happened, but he couldn't say more. Years later, I met someone about the investigation who was very familiar with AWACS, but who didn't know what I knew. He mentioned that the American AWACS have a phenomenal jamming capacity. I don't know if I had a light bulb moment immediately, or if it happened thinking back to this conversation and rereading my notes. But in any case, I finally understood the meaning and importance of the AWACS that were present. I know they were there. I had just learned from a very reliable source that the AWACS have a phenomenal jamming capability. Therefore, the AWACS jammed flight MH370.
According to the military experts we consulted, this hypothesis seems implausible. First, while these aircrafts do have electronic jamming capabilities, they don't have the means to completely remove a Boeing 777 from radar and cut it off from all means of communication without affecting the entire airspace in the area. In addition, the maximum speed of an AWACS is 870 kilometers per hour, but flight MH370 flew at a speed of 950 kilometers per hour. Tailing it was hence impossible. Despite these technical elements, the reporter explains herself.
That's how my scenario started forming, to put it that way. Looking closely again at the official report, I also saw there were 2.5 tons of electronic equipment. This electronic equipment was escorted to the plane on the same evening when the passengers boarded. That's something unheard of. Moreover, this cargo was embarked without being scanned. Something like this never happens. It's totally impossible. An airline should lose its license for taking on board 2.5 tons of anything, as we don't know what it was, without having scanned it.
The Malaysian investigation report, however, specifies the contents of this cargo: lithium batteries made by Motorola. Also stated is the fact that the cargo was not scanned at Kuala Lumpur Airport because it was physically inspected by the company in charge of its transport, mass cargo, and checked before being transported under the seal to the hold of flight MH370. Despite this information, Florence Duchangy continues her counter-investigation in search of new elements.
I remember the testimony from someone who had contacted me with utter conviction. not to mention relentlessness, to tell me that he swore to God that he had seen footage on Vietnamese television showing the plane being recovered the very day after the crash. So, we have credible human testimony that also corroborates the thesis, or the hypothesis, rather, of a crash in the South China Sea.
This footage, already broadcast on Vietnamese television, remains untraceable today. However, at the end of her investigation, the reporter formulated a hypothesis based on her research. What if Flight MH370 was carrying sensitive cargo and had fallen victim to a military operation in the Chinese Sea involving the United States? A scenario far removed from the official Malaysian investigation.
Well, first you have to find a valid reason. Was there a valid reason to do this? Regarding Inmarsat, some people say they're British and at the beck and call of the Americans. Now we're getting into conspiracy theories. What reason did they or the Americans have for hiding it? Other people have said that secret cargo had been loaded onto the plane. Do you think the Americans had to shoot down a plane? If they wanted to recover something, they'd have done it without doing that. I don't believe any of these theories.
Aeronautical experts remain cautious about calling into question the few clues available to solve this mystery.
If you are selective in the information you wish to use, you can tell a story. Scientific research should not be doing that. It should be saying, what is the real evidence? Undisputed evidence, what are the facts, and then draw conclusions from the whole story, not through selective identification of, this is the information I wish to use, this information doesn't support my position, so I'm going to ignore it, and by ignoring that and only telling one part of the story, I can convince people to believe that what I'm saying is the fact. That's not the right way to do a proper investigation of an aircraft incident.
How can one continue to seek truth without falling into the trap of speculation? For some experts, it's about digging into the negligence of the Malaysian investigation. In Belfast, Northern Ireland, Don Thompson tirelessly pursues his counter-investigation, looking for new credible clues. Looking back at the conclusions of the official report, the engineer realizes that an aeronautical technology was completely neglected during the investigation, ADS-B.
ADS-B is a very useful technology. It's been used across the world, and it's a significant tool in the future of air navigation. That is typically GPS, a global navigation satellite system.
Around the world, the ADS-B station network receives and records aircraft flight data and redistributes it to control towers in the area. This technology allows aircraft controllers to see the aircrafts on their radar screens.
It's actually providing the same level of surveillance data as modern radar systems do, but it includes the actual position of the aircraft, the definition of the position of the aircraft.
But Don Thompson is surprised that this data is entirely absent from the official report. With further research, he makes a discovery.
I had read that the Department of Civil Aviation had an operational ADS-B site in Malaysia, on the east coast of Malaysia, looking out over the South China Sea. But this had never been mentioned. No data collected from that had ever been mentioned.
In Malaysia, 4 ADS-B stations did record data related to Flight MH370. Yet none of the 1,000 pages of the official report mentions it. Very quickly, Don Thompson tries to recover this data from Malaysian Civil Aviation.
The next day, I had an email with a log of about 4 hours worth of data from that ADS-B station, about 6 million records of transmissions from aircraft, including MH370.
The engineer delves into this data and learns of a fundamental element pertaining to the disappearance of flight MH370. The transponder, the tool allowing the plane to be seen by the control tower, did not suddenly stop emitting, as would be the case during a crash. It was gradually switched off step by step from inside the cockpit.
The transponder control panel has a switch, a 5-position switch. At one extreme of the 5 positions, it's fully functional. At the other extreme, the transponder is instructed to go into standby mode. So what I believe has happened is that the transponder mode select switch was being cycled from fully operational down to standby.
We realized that it had indeed been shut off manually because there were several positions on the button, and each one corresponds to a piece of information. Since this information was gradually removed, it's almost certain that a person voluntarily turned the button of the transponder to standby. This was a voluntary act done by a person.
Thanks to this new data, investigators make an unprecedented discovery. A person inside the cockpit intentionally tried to make flight MH370 disappear.
I saw a plane that turned off its electronics, did a 180, and hightailed it in the other direction. Right off the bat, that tells me that it's not an accident, that it was intentional, and that whoever did it knew what they were doing. And to me, that suggested intent, and it suggested sophistication.
Who among the 239 people on board could be behind this hijacking? On March 16, 2014, 1 week after the loss of flight MH370, Interpol cleared all passengers on board the aircraft from suspicion.
Once the possibility became apparent that somebody on the plane took it, it became very interesting, okay, who was on this plane? Who might have done it? And so one of the first things the authorities did was to put out word to all the countries whose citizens were on board the plane and say, can you check these people out? And everyone came back and said, yep, they're fine.
As evidence of a hijacking accumulates, how can one go further? For the experts continuing this counter-investigation, the time has come to explore an essential lead, that of the pilot of flight MH370. How to find out more about Zaharia Ahmed Shah, the pilot of flight MH370? In 2019, Patrick Blaley, himself a plane captain, came across a major piece of information, the confidential investigation report of the Malaysian police.
The files of the Malaysian police leaked onto the internet, meaning everyone had access to them. Indeed, they dug into his life. There wasn't much to say about his personal life. As they say in the file, he no longer had the same goals as his family. So he was a little taciturn at that time. His personal life weighed on him. He locked himself in his simulator at home. He was no longer in tune with his family, from what I understand. That's what's mentioned in the Malaysian police report.
But beyond the personality of the pilot, was there material evidence of his guilt? In the police report, investigators make a striking discovery.
Once it became clear that somebody on board the plane took the plane, the chief suspect right out of the gate was the pilot. The veteran Malaysian Airlines pilot Zaharie Ahmad Shah. And he loved to fly so much that he had in his basement a flight simulator.
Flight recorder, it's on. Voice recorder, tested.
He would take this, and on his free time, when he wasn't working flying airplanes, he would play working airplanes. And so the police went to his home and they took the computer, and it had various hard drives and everything, and they looked through the hard drives and they found files, the different flights that he would do.
The investigators looked at his hard drive and extracted the data in the memory cache. They found 8 coordinate points. The recovered trajectory points pass through the Malacca Strait, and the last 2 go to the southern Indian Ocean. People don't take this as proof, but to me, it's indisputable. He had marked 2 points in the southern Indian Ocean with fuel at 0. And on March 8th, he ended up in the southern Indian Ocean with fuel at 0. To me, it's kind of a presumption of guilt, because he had clearly thought out this case scenario. He did so on a simulator, granted, but the actual scenario happened 3 weeks later.
It looked like he was practicing, like about a month before the plane disappeared, he was practicing doing the kind of flight that it seemed like he ultimately did. And so for a lot of people, like, this was kind of case closed. This was the final nail in the coffin that established without a doubt that Zaharie was the culprit and that the plane really did go in the Southern Indian Ocean. Now,
manual shutdown of the transponder, simulator training over the Indian Ocean. The noose tightens around the pilot, who seems to have intentionally vanished with his 239 passengers. But how could this hypothesis be put to the test in the field? In 2020, Greek engineer Argyris Kamoulakos begins his own investigation. His objective, to try to find out more about the crash thanks to the debris of the plane found in 2015.
As far as I know, very, very few people actually assess the information that can come out of the debris, and they do it in an empirical way, let's say. Based on their own past experience in their careers, they would say, it looks like this is what happened. So I propose to go further than it looks like, but actually do simulations and analysis and develop formulas to assess precisely what is going on. We went in a very scientific way to see what we can interpret from the information that exists.
Could this debris shed more light on the fate of Flight MH370? During his investigation, the engineer makes a first discovery.
We know that there was no cloud of debris that was discovered. Maybe we missed it? Maybe we arrived too late? Maybe most of it sunk? But yet, those who survived and they floated around and they arrived years later on the coast of Africa should have been from all sides. It's not the case. Practically all the debris that is credible comes from the right side of the plane.
How to interpret this astonishing coincidence? As an expert in aeronautical structures, Argyris Kamoulakos engages in complex calculations. Using a supercomputer, he simulates the impact of the plane on the sea from the recovered debris. After several days of work, he's able to define a very precise scenario.
I believe the wing broke. The engine was liberated and passed over the wing and hit the tailplane. So the aircraft, to my opinion, should be possibly in 4 pieces. We should have the right wing from the position of the engine outwards as one piece, the engine has another piece. The front part of the fuselage, it will detach with the violent impact with the sea, and then the rest of the plane, an integral part. This is what I think the wreckage could look like.
What can be deduced from this simulation? To Argyris Kamulakos, there's no doubt. Flight MH370 was not the victim of an in-flight accident or explosion.
To my opinion, a credible end of flight of the MH370 was a ditching attempt that didn't go as it was supposed to, with the right wing hitting violently the water, and then the rest of the aircraft hit the water. We are not facing a catastrophic crash and disintegration of the aircraft. We are facing a missed ditching biased from the right side of the aircraft.
To this engineer, the analysis of the debris is clear. There was someone at the controls of the plane until the very last second. Could Flight MH370 have been a suicide flight carefully planned by the pilot? This scenario is not impossible. This is evidenced by the 2015 crash of a Germanwings A320.
Some pilots have committed suicidal acts before. Unfortunately, there's an example close to home. The Germanwings accident, where the pilot deliberately crashed the plane in the Alps. You obviously have to pay a lot of attention to the mental health of the pilot. But these events are so rare that you can't generalize either.
But if it was indeed of suicide, taking all the passengers with him, why did he fly incognito for 7 hours? Why orchestrate everything so carefully that the plane would never be found?
I think he wanted to disappear. He wanted to vanish from the face of the earth with his plane and his passengers and never be found. He wanted to disappear without having the responsibility put on his shoulders. It's understandable, because afterwards, his family would have suffered the consequences. His family would have been told that their father killed 239 passengers in the depths of the Indian Ocean. I think his family would have taken it very badly, and understandably so. I think he didn't want to leave that image behind. So, if it was indeed a suicide, why didn't he do it in the morning when he left home? It's the same thing with Germanwings. Andreas Lubitz should have crashed his car into a wall or a tree, but he didn't. He wanted to die at the controls of his plane. I think that Zahari Shah wanted to leave with his plane to a place where he would never be found. But unfortunately for him, he forgot two things. First, he had left the simulator with the famous traces that we found, the 2 coordinates. And second, Inmarsat. He didn't know about the traceability that enabled us to reconstruct arcs. And thanks to these arcs, we were able to put together the trajectory. So he thought of everything except 2 things, the arcs and his simulator, from which he didn't erase the data.
Nearly a decade after the disappearance of Flight MH370, experts continue to analyze the available evidence in hopes of seeing more clearly. But they also know that in the absence of the plane, caution is essential.
I was immediately convinced that it was very important to have an opinion on the pilot, the captain. It makes a huge difference to know whether or not the captain might be guilty of something in this case. That's why I decided to meet with his relatives. One of the very important meetings I had was with his older sister, Sakinab, who told me about the little brother whom she loved and about his life journey. I realized that, on one hand, the man, the captain, was a good man, and on the other hand, that it was wrong to accuse the pilot.
I think we need to be careful in terms of placing blame on individuals when we really don't know what happened. To accuse someone of being suicidal and homicidal, that is a major accusation, and we don't have conclusive evidence that that is the case. I think it is a possibility, but I also don't want to make a strong assertion that that is what happened, because the fact is we don't know.
Will we ever find the precious black boxes of Flight MH370?
Looking for a plane in the Indian Ocean is like looking for a needle in a haystack. It is. But technology will continue to evolve. The company that looked for the wreckage in 2018 has announced capabilities for next year that are almost 5 to 6 times greater than they had before. So, I'd say maybe 20 years from now, we'll have automated systems to scan the bottom of the oceans. And if we start by the area near the 7th arc, we're bound to stumble upon it.
The truth is, until we find that aircraft, we will never truly know what happened to the MH370 flight.
Today, the families of the missing continue to lobby the authorities to resume the search for Flight MH370. Along with independent experts, they represent the only line of defense against the abandonment of one of the most complex aeronautical investigations of the 21st century. They all know that the only recovery of the black boxes could make it possible to determine whether the truth lies somewhere among the hundreds of theories formulated so far.